Under a cold white morning sky, Sergeant Keith Reyes moved in ceremonial cadence beside the casket transfer lane, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm across stone that held the nation's grief without complaint. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat, while marble columns and rows of white headstones watched like silent sentinels, and the gathered crowd stood hushed, as if history itself had risen and taken attendance. Mist sat low over Arlington that morning, not heavy enough to hide anything, just enough to soften the edges of distance so each line of headstones seemed to continue into memory itself. The memorial amphitheater rose in pale arcs, every column bright against the gray of the hour, its marble glowing like polished bone under winter light. Bugle notes drifted from the far side of the grounds and traveled on the thin air in clean, mournful lines. They did not fill the space so much as consecrate it. Men and women who had served stood shoulder to shoulder with families who had only known service through loss, and for several breaths no one moved except the sentinels on detail. Keith stood 6'2", broad through the shoulders, built like a wall that had learned to walk upright, yet every inch of him was governed by precision rather than force. His face was an unreadable mask of discipline, hair cropped close, jaw set, eyes sharp and level, fixed on a point only he could see until they shifted, almost invisibly, to account for each movement in the front rows, a hand tightening around a folded program, a veteran adjusting his cap, a child leaning against a parent's coat. His uniform was immaculate in the old, unforgiving way, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, brass bright enough to catch even that muted sky, white gloves pristine, kepi hat perfectly angled, tomb guard badge centered over his chest like a vow cast in metal. To the crowd he looked motionless between strides, almost mechanical in the way ceremony can appear to civilians. Inside, he tracked everything: distance, timing, lanes, faces, breathing patterns, the placement of a wheelchair 2 rows left, the volunteer medic standing near the aisle with a black trauma bag at her feet, the clergy detail ready at the lower steps, the casket team waiting under cover beyond sightline. His composure was absolute, but it was not passive. It was trained. It was earned. It was a skill forged in steel and fire, then disciplined into silence. By the first week of November, the cold had acquired that hard clarity unique to Arlington mornings, the kind that made every footstep ring sharper and every breath visible for a second before vanishing. Families had arrived before sunrise, some in dark coats too light for the temperature, because grief did not check weather reports, some carrying framed photographs, some carrying only each other, only each. School children with folded programs sat in a guided section near the east aisle, their usual restlessness subdued by architecture, uniforms, and the sensed gravity of grown adults who were trying not to break. Several elderly veterans wore ribboned caps and unit pins, hands spotted with age and folded over canes or knees, their postures straightening each time a uniform passed. Near the second column, an elderly Marine in a wheelchair had positioned himself with deliberate care so he could see the transfer lane without obstruction. His jacket bore old insignia and fresh pressing, the kind of detail that told anyone watching this was not routine for him. A teenage boy stood 1 row behind him, phone in hand at first, then lowered to his side once the bugle sounded. A young girl in a navy coat held a folded burial flag against her chest with both arms, too small for the weight of cloth and meaning, yet holding it with solemn concentration. A mother in civilian black reached down to rest fingers lightly on the girl's shoulder, not to guide her, only to anchor them both. Nothing in the amphitheater was accidental, not the lane markings, not the spacing between honor detail positions, not the measured pace of movement. through corridors of stone and memory. The order itself communicated a moral fact. Sacrifice would not be hurried, and remembrance would not be reduced to convenience. Keith understood that with the certainty of muscle memory. He had practiced these movements until they were reflex, then practiced again until reflex became ritual. Each turn had angle and purpose. Each pause had duration and meaning. He marched as one man, but he carried the cadence of all who had stood that watch before him. He was 31 years old, 2 Afghanistan tours, 1 Syria deployment, Bronze Star with valor, a narrow scar beneath the left jaw where shrapnel had torn through dust and smoke outside Kandahar and left him alive when probability argued otherwise. None of those details appeared in his bearing. The crowd saw polish, stillness, authority. What they could not see was the catalog of places his body remembered without invitation. Rotor wash flattening sand at midnight, radio calls clipped by static, heat coming off armored metal, the smell of cordite and diesel mingled with medic gauze. Those memories did not announce themselves. They stood down when called. That was discipline. That was duty reshaped from surviving into serving. On mornings like this, another name always stood beside him, even when no one spoke it aloud. Staff Sergeant Lucas McKenna, called Mac by everyone who knew him, had been all blunt humor and steady hands. The kind of man who could make a team breathe easier with one line in the dark. Once, in a plywood mess hall lit by flickering bulbs, Mac had lifted a burned metal pot and said, deadpan, "If I burn this coffee again, tell command I'm committing war crimes." The platoon had laughed harder than the joke deserved, because laughter in a war zone was less entertainment than oxygen. Later, during an extraction that went wrong in seconds, Mac had shielded 2 younger soldiers and paid the full cost before the helicopter cleared the ridge. Keith had knelt beside him under red rotor light and learned how loud silence could be. He did not carry that memory as spectacle. He carried it as instruction. The tomb and every associated duty gave him a framework combat never had time to provide. Grief could be ordered into service, anger could be disciplined into protection, and love for the fallen could be made visible through precision. 21 steps were not performance. They were promise. A vow to guard memory with body, breath, and attention, so families arriving on the worst day of their lives would find not chaos, not improvisation, but structure strong enough to hold them. In that framework, honor was not language, it was conduct. The wards had entered quietly and taken their assigned seats near the transfer lane, accompanied by relatives who moved with that careful choreography. Families adopt when one person is close to collapse and everyone is pretending not to notice. Elena Ward wore black gloves and held a handkerchief, folded into a square so exact it looked prepared for inspection. Her shoulders were set with determination, but fatigue showed around her eyes in the way only long nights and unanswered questions can carve. Beside her, her son kept his chin high and stared straight ahead. In the row behind, the little granddaughter with the folded flag watched the honor detail with wide, fixed attention, as if memorizing every movement for someone who could no longer witness it. Keith registered each of them with professional neutrality, then with something quieter and deeper that never appeared on his face. He had seen too many families meet finality in too many settings to mistake composure for strength or silence for peace. His instincts remained on high alert, not because he expected disorder, but because sacred spaces demanded protection from all forms of harm, including the ordinary human collapse that grief could trigger without warning. To civilians, ceremony often looked static. To him, it was dynamic risk management wrapped in reverence. Every lane had to stay clear. Every support role had to remain accessible. Every second had to belong first to the fallen and those left behind. The wind shifted once, carrying the crisp scent of cut grass from lower slopes and the faint oil-metal note from ceremonial equipment being checked beyond view. A chaplain stepped into position near the lectern and lowered his eyes. A detail NCO at the outer rail gave a minimal hand signal, then returned to stillness. 3 rows back, a veteran nurse in a dark coat and silver service pin watched with the evaluative calm of someone who had spent decades reading pain before it turned into crisis. She noticed what most civilians never did: Keith's gaze pattern, the subtle way it revisited aisle intersections, front row posture, and medic access points in a continuous loop. Her expression tightened with recognition, not concern. She knew exactly what kind of training she was witnessing. In the amphitheater's upper tier, media personnel kept to a designated perimeter, cameras mounted and angled according to pre-cleared lines that respected military protocol and family privacy. Cables were taped, crew badges visible, equipment cases stacked behind rail markers. From this distance, it all appeared orderly, one more layer of modern logistics orbiting ancient rites. Keith marked their positions, too, not with hostility, simply with completeness. His duty did not permit selective attention. It required total awareness under total control. Minutes passed in measured increments. A cloud cover drifted thinly across the white sun, and the marble briefly dimmed before brightening again. The crowd remained quiet, yet emotion moved through them in subtle waves. A throat cleared and caught, a shoulder bowed, then straightened. A hand reached and found another hand without looking. The young girl with the folded flag adjusted her grip and pressed the cloth closer. The teenage boy in the back pocketed his phone entirely. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair sat taller, jaw set, eyes wet but unblinking. Keith completed another cycle of cadence along the lane. Boots struck stone with exact tempo. He paused, turned, and resumed, each movement clean enough to be mistaken for simplicity by anyone who had never endured the hours required to perform it under pressure. What no one could have guessed from his calm exterior was the relentless computation beneath it, the way his mind held ceremony and contingency in the same frame, prepared to preserve both honor and life at the exact same moment if called. He marched in silence, but the silence was not empty. It was loaded with duty, legacy, and the weight of something bigger than himself. And as the service edged toward its most fragile moments, the sacred order held. Then the profane reached for the sacred with a manicured hand and a production schedule. Derek Sloan cut out of the media perimeter with a sharp sidestep that ignored the taped boundary on the stone. His charcoal suit fitted close enough to advertise money, his gold cufflinks flashing, when he raised one hand to his earpiece and snapped at a camera operator to tighten frame. He moved like a man accustomed to hallways opening for him, to assistants clearing space, to grief treated as visual texture behind his deadlines. 2 members of his crew followed with a bundled coil of cable and a rolling battery pack, angling straight toward the Gold Star seating lane, as if painted lines and posted protocol were suggestions for other people. A volunteer usher stepped forward with both palms lifted and a quiet warning. Sloan brushed past without looking at him. The first audible break in the ceremony came not from the bugle, not from the honor detail, but from Sloan's voice carrying across marble in a hard, impatient bark. "Keep that lane clear for the shot. I don't care who's standing there." The words struck wrong in the amphitheater. Too loud, too commercial, too careless for ground that held names and absences in equal measure. Heads turned. A mother in the 3rd row stiffened. The teenage boy who had pocketed his phone brought it halfway back out by reflex, then stopped, sensing the moral temperature of the moment drop. The veteran nurse near the aisle shifted one step toward her trauma bag, eyes already tracking where the cable spool was headed. Keith Reyes completed his turn and stepped into the next cadence cycle as if the disturbance were weather passing at the edge of range. Boots clicked. Rifle remained steady. Face stayed carved from stone. To anyone without training, he looked like a ceremonial figure, insulated by discipline from ordinary human friction. Yet his gaze recalibrated in one sweep that took in Sloane's trajectory, the cable crew's intrusion angle, the narrowed gap to the medic aisle, and Elena Ward's posture in the front row. Her shoulders had been set. Now they dipped. Color drained from her face in a visible tide. Her gloved fingers tightened around the folded handkerchief once, then loosened. Her son saw it and leaned in. She tried to answer him, but breath caught high in her chest. Sloane saw none of that. He stepped directly between the volunteer medic and the family aisle, pointed at Keith with the impatience of a foreman scolding a day laborer, and delivered the line that would stain his career in every room where military protocol still meant something. "Move, parade boy. You're blocking the shot." The crowd froze. It froze in layers. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair rose halfway on his armrests as if old reflex still expected him to close distance. The little girl in the navy coat clutched the folded burial flag to her chest so hard her knuckles blanched. Two schoolchildren in the east section stopped whispering mid-syllable and stared wide-eyed toward the lane. A father with a service pin reached across his wife without taking his eyes off Sloane, protective and incredulous in the same movement. Even the camera operator nearest the rail hesitated, with his hand on focus, suddenly aware he was filming not ceremony, but a violation. Elena Ward swayed. It was not dramatic. It was the small, terrible tilt of a body that had carried too much for too long. Her knees bent, her chin dipped. She shifted toward the stone edge of the aisle where a fall would be sudden and unforgiving. Her son's hand darted for her elbow, missed once on wool sleeve, caught only air. The volunteer medic lunged around Sloane's shoulder, blocked by cable and equipment for one critical beat. Gasps rippled through the amphitheater in fractured whispers. "Ma'am, catch her. Oh, God." Keith's cadence did not break, but his internal map changed at combat speed. Distance, 6 paces. Obstruction, 1 civilian male. Broad stance, right foot planted across medic lane. Secondary obstruction, cable loop under tension, trip risk, patient trajectory. Leftward collapse toward stone. Available intercept window, less than 2 seconds. Behind him, the casket transfer corridor remained clear by inches that mattered. Before him, a family stood at the edge of preventable harm, while a man with an earpiece treated a funeral like a set. What Sloane did not know in that instant could have filled volumes, and every missing fact stood against him like witness testimony. He did not know the sentinel he had called parade boy had read blast shock in men twice his age and triaged casualties under rotor wash while rounds cracked overhead. He did not know that beneath the immaculate uniform was a veteran who had learned to identify collapse by jaw tension and fingertip tremor before full syncope hit. He did not know the Tomb Guard badge on Keith's chest was not pageantry, but credential earned through attrition, memorization, endurance, and a moral code that treated families of the fallen as an extension of the sacred itself. He did not know Keith had practiced preserving ceremonial precision under stress until reaction became doctrine. Sloane only knew camera angles. He lifted his arm again to signal his crew and took one more half step into the lane, and in doing so he blocked the final direct path the medic needed. A hush heavier than silence settled over the amphitheater. Bugle notes had ended. Wind moved through the upper colonnade with a low, dry whisper. Somewhere in the back row, a program slipped from numb fingers and landed flat on stone. The sound carried. Elena's eyes rolled shut for a moment, then opened unfocused. Her balance went. Keith took his next step. Time narrowed to a corridor no wider than that transfer lane, and everyone inside it became witness to the same truth. Ceremony was never decoration, and discipline was never passive. The nation often saw the old guard at a distance, polished brass, exact cadence, immaculate bearing, and mistook precision for pageantry. In that suspended second, the illusion burned away. Keith was not there to ornament grief. He was there to protect the living who carried it. He felt the old combat mathematics rise without panic, clean and immediate, the way trained memory surfaced when stakes turned absolute. His breathing remained measured. Shoulders stayed squared. To the crowd, he looked unflinching, almost serene, but every muscle through his back and core had coiled for controlled motion. He counted the rhythm between Elena's center of gravity and the stone edge. He marked Sloane's footing. He registered where the medic's hands would arrive if given an opening. He tracked the location of the little girl with the folded flag and confirmed she was outside the fall path. That last check took less than a blink and mattered as much as anything else. Colonel Ava Whitaker's directive sat in Keith's mind with the clarity of a live command, stripped to essentials he could execute under pressure. Protect ceremony, protect lanes, protect families. If protocol and safety ever collided, preserve life first and answer for every inch afterward. He held that order with the same single nod he gave all lawful directives, filing it beside older lessons written under darker skies. Duty was not rigid. Duty was exact. Sloane's crewman with the cable spool finally sensed the wrongness and tried to backpedal, but the coil snagged on a stanchion post, tightening across the aisle like a low wire. The volunteer medic dropped to one knee, reached for a gap under the cable, and called out, "Move him! Move him now!" Her tone carried the authority of someone who had seen this turn fatal in less prepared places. Sloane glanced at her, annoyed rather than alarmed, and lifted his chin toward Keith again, as if doubling down could rewrite reality. "Hold position," he barked into his headset. "We're live in 10. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud but charged. One tourist hissed, "At a funeral?" A veteran 2 rows back answered under his breath, "He has no idea who he's talking to." Now the teenage boy near the Marine shifted left, eyes wide, not filming now, just watching with the stunned focus of someone seeing adulthood split into 2 species, those who serve and those who consume. Keith advanced 1 pace closer. His white gloves remained steady at regulation height. His boots struck stone with the same measured report as every step before it. That sound, sharp, controlled, unhurried, did more to steady the front rows than any shouted command could have done. Elena's son reached again for his mother and caught her forearm this time, but her weight was already moving away from him. He could not anchor her alone. Her granddaughter, still clutching the folded flag, whispered, "Grandma," in a thin voice that cut deeper than the earlier shouting. The veteran nurse, near the second column, moved toward the aisle, then stopped exactly where training and respect told her to stop, because she could read the geometry unfolding and knew one more body in the lane could make rescue harder, not easier. Her gaze settled on Keith's shoulders, and she understood, with professional certainty, that he had already solved it. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair lowered himself back down, jaw tight, trusting the sentinel in front of him, With the same instinct, he once trusted men on his left and right. By the middle of that November morning, the cold had sharpened enough that breath showed in brief white bursts above black coats and polished shoes. In that pale air, the contrast became almost symbolic. Sloane's cufflinks caught the light like small coins, while Keith's Tomb Guard badge held it like a promise. One represented purchased access, the other represented earned authority measured in years, not invoices. Elena's knees buckled. The medic surged again, blocked by Sloane's stance and cable tension for one final fraction. Keith stepped into intercept range. His eyes lifted from Elena's dropping shoulders to Sloane's face for a single, level beat. And the look in them carried no anger, no theatrics, only command presence so complete it felt older than either man. It was the gaze of a sentinel trained to see what everyone else missed, and what he saw now was simple. A mother of the fallen needed protection, and a civilian contractor stood in the way of it. Around them, the amphitheater held its breath. The crowd did not speak. Cameras kept rolling because hands forgot to stop them. The chaplain at the lectern remained still, head bowed as if prayer itself were waiting for the next motion. From the upper steps, an MP detail, alerted by gesture and radio, started down at a controlled run, black shoes biting marble in synchronized impacts. Colonel Whitaker was already in motion from the command post corridor, closing distance with the velocity of institutional consequence. Keith began the pivot on cadence, the exact turn where ritual and rescue would become one act. Keith began the pivot on cadence, the exact turn where ritual and rescue would become one act. And in that fractional rotation, the amphitheater seemed to sharpen around him with almost unbearable clarity. Cold light washed over marble and made every edge luminous. The upper colonnade held a thin draft that smelled of stone, winter cloth, and cut grass from lower slopes. Breath clouded briefly above black coats and vanished. Somewhere beyond the rail, a bell from a maintenance cart gave a single, muted chime. Then silence reclaimed the grounds as if even machinery understood where it stood. From the west steps, the headstones descended in disciplined rows, white against dormant grass, each marker a measured declaration that service had a name even when sacrifice had no witness. Bugle metal still carried a faint tang in the air from the final note. Programs trembled in gloved hands. Shoes shifted once on cold stone, then stilled. The amphitheater held all of it. Grief contained by architecture, duty contained by procedure, and a nation's memory contained by people refusing to look away. Keith's uniform moved through that stillness like a standard. The kepi hat sat at a perfect angle, brimline true to regulation, chin level. His coat lay flat over his frame, every seam aligned, every crease cut with unforgiving precision. Brass buttons caught pale light in controlled points rather than glare. His white gloves were spotless, fingers steady, wrists locked in trained economy. The Tomb Guard badge at his chest did not glitter, it anchored. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, struck stone with the exact report of ceremony under pressure, and that sound gave frightened civilians something to hold on to while Elena Ward's balance failed in front of them. The crowd became a living ledger of America in one frozen glance. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair, ribboned cap low over wet eyes, had surged forward once, knuckles white on his armrests, then forced himself still and trusted Keith to do what needed doing. 2 rows back, a retired Army nurse with silver hair pinned at the nape and a service pin at her lapel tracked Elena's shoulders the way she had once tracked triage lines, calm inside urgency, ready but deliberately holding position so she would not clog the rescue lane. A middle school boy in a borrowed blazer lowered his phone completely, and stepped behind his mother's shoulder, stunned into respect. A father, with a purple heart plate on his lapel, angled his body in front of his daughter, without taking his gaze off the aisle. The little girl in the navy coat kept the folded flag tight against her chest, lips parted, eyes fixed on Keith as though trying to memorize courage in real time. Near the outer rail, clergy stood in black wool and white collars, heads bowed but alert. Volunteer ushers wore laminated badges that trembled on lanyards against dark coats. One medic remained crouched, trauma bag open, latex cuffs tucked at her wrist, waiting for a lane that should have been clear. Media lights sat cold on tripod heads, not yet raised, and cables ran in black lines across stone where they were supposed to end. Derek Sloan's crew had dragged one coil beyond that boundary, and the loop now lay taut and wrong, a modern hazard laid across sacred geometry. Keith saw all of it while maintaining the measured face the public knew, carved from stone, unreadable, restrained. Inside, his perception partitioned the field into priorities with machine precision. Elena's center of gravity had broken left. Her son's grip was partial and sliding. The medic's access was obstructed at knee height by cable tension and a planted civilian foot. The child with the folded flag remained outside impact range by less than a yard. The casket transfer corridor remained clear. No one in the upper lane was moving fast enough to alter the next second. His breathing stayed even. He did not rush. He solved. By late morning in the first week of November, the cold had settled deeper into the amphitheater seats, and the crowd wore it in red knuckles, tightened scarves, and shoulders drawn high against the wind. Yet the emotional temperature burned hotter with each suspended beat. People who had arrived as observers now stood as witnesses to a different covenant being defended in real time. Family first, dignity first, the sacred lane inviolate. Keith's body held ceremonial stillness, while his mind ran combat math. 31 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Syria, Bronze Star with valor, he carried an old shrapnel scar tucked below his left jawline that caught light only at certain angles. That history was not nostalgia. It was operating software. In Kandahar and near Spin Boldak, crowd reading meant survival. In Syria, lane control under compression meant people made it home or did not. Those disciplines now mapped directly onto marble instead of dust. Identify collapse vector, preserve access corridor, prevent secondary injury, move without panic. A flash of memory came and went in less than a breath. Mac in a plywood chow tent, holding up burned coffee with priestly solemnity. If this brew can wake the dead, command owes me a promotion. Another followed harder. Rotor wash flattening dust, an extraction gone catastrophic. Mac taking the hit meant for younger soldiers, then forcing out the order that had become Keith's private doctrine. Don't let them march alone, Reyes. The words did not slow him now. They focused him. Old Guard training had turned that focus into precision that civilians mistook for mere pageantry. Selection attrited ego first. Protocol, weather endurance, weapon handling, step count, turn geometry, uniform discipline, and emergency contingencies had to be repeatable under stress until hesitation disappeared. 21 steps were remembrance, but they were also timing control. At the tomb, cadence taught the nervous system to stay exact when adrenaline demanded speed. That exactness was the difference between an honorable intervention and a scene that broke dignity in front of a grieving family. 3 days before this service, Keith had reviewed sight lanes twice with the leadership, marking medic access, wheelchair clearances, media perimeter, and stress points around Gold Star seating. The front row aisle had been the obvious vulnerability because the Ward family requested proximity to the transfer corridor. Elena Ward's support note was brief: exhaustion, prolonged bereavement risk, and he filed it where he filed all soft indicators that could become hard events. He also remembered Derek Sloan's check-in packet: private security director for a major network, designated perimeter support only. Boundaries had been explicit. Sloan treated them as negotiable the moment he smelled a better angle. First came loud-shot priority commands that cut across prayer, then the push beyond media limits, then the dragged cable loop into the medic lane. Then, when Keith held cadence and recalculated, the open contempt. "Move, parade boy." That insult had not registered as personal. It had registered as a threat indicator from a man prioritizing live-stream timing over human safety. The volunteer medic made another attempt, crouch-walking low, one hand out, but Sloane's body and the cable tension forced her to check short again. Her boot clipped the outer loop. She caught herself, muttered a sharp breath, reset. The veteran nurse saw the same geometry and stayed planted, jaw tight, refusing to become a second obstacle. An usher lifted a hand halfway as if to direct traffic, then dropped it when he understood there was no traffic pattern left to direct, only an imminent fall. Up the command corridor, Colonel Ava Whitaker moved with clipped urgency, eyes already on Sloan and the obstructed lane, posture carrying command authority before she reached speaking distance. Behind and above, MP detail descended at a controlled run, spacing clean, hands-free, scanning for civilian spillover. Their arrival was certain. Their timing was not soon enough to own this second. Elena's pallor had gone waxy. Her head tipped, then lagged behind her shoulders by a fraction that told Keith neuromuscular control was failing. Her son shifted to her right side and hooked under her elbow, but his footing was compromised by the same cable path choking the lane. He could slow her descent, not stop it. The granddaughter did not move, just clutched the folded flag tighter, eyes wide and unblinking. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair swallowed hard, shoulders trembling once before he steadied, chin coming up as if saluting from where he sat. The teenage boy who had stopped filming kept both hands at his sides now, phone forgotten, gaze fixed on Keith with the stunned attention of someone witnessing standards become action. Clergy remained where they were, ceremony suspended in a thin, electric quiet. Camera operators, some still recording despite the protocol breach, tracked the center aisle with predatory reflexes that looked suddenly small beside what was unfolding. Keith's right heel struck, then his left, each contact exact. Cadence was no longer merely audible. It was the metronome governing everyone else's fear. He adjusted his line by inches, preserving ceremonial bearing while opening interception angle. His chin remained level. His eyes did not flicker. The public expression stayed impassive because panic is contagious, and he would not spread it. Another fragment surfaced from training blocks and vanished immediately. Never telegraph acceleration to a destabilized subject. Sudden movement can pull them farther off center, so he gave Elena a stable visual anchor instead of a rush. His left shoulder opened a degree more. His weight shifted forward through the ball of the planted foot. Distance collapsed from 2 strides to 1.5. Sloan barked something at his crew about staying live. One camera op stepped into the restricted edge to follow him. Cable pulled tighter across the stone. The medic checked left for a new angle and found none. Her eyes snapped to Keith, then to Elena, and she held, trusting the intercept. The casket transfer corridor remained clear by discipline and luck. If Elena fell unchecked, she would hit marble on her left side, likely shoulder first, then temple. If her son overcommitted, both could go down to the cable and create a pileup that trapped airway access. If bystanders surged, the granddaughter would be inside impact chaos. Keith's field decomposition ran those branches in less than a heartbeat and discarded all but one path. Take Elena high at torso level before knee collapse completed. Shield the sun's rotation. Keep the child outside arc. Preserve lane for medic entry on contact. He turned through the next count. Boot leather whispered against stone at the pivot point. White glove tracked exactly where ceremony demanded, then lowered with microscopic deviation only someone equally trained could detect. To civilians, it still looked like flawless ritual. To anyone who understood body mechanics, it was an intercept setup executed inside regulation posture. Elena's knees began to fold. Her son said, "Mom," low and breaking, trying to lift and brace in the same motion. The effort shifted his balance backward. His heel slid half an inch on cold stone. The medic rose from her crouch, ready to surge once the lane opened. The veteran nurse inhaled and held. From above, one MP called a short warning to clear the lane. Voice clipped, not yet close enough to physically intervene. Colonel Whitaker reached the lower steps, line of sight fully on Sloan. He still had not yielded space. Keith closed the final gap. For one suspended instant, marble uniforms, white headstones, grieving family, and moving command all locked into a single frame. Mac's order sat quiet at the base of Keith's ribs. Old guard cadence held his spine. Combat triage held his timing, his right boot planted exactly on count. His torso aligned to preserve ceremonial bearing. His left side opened into Elena's falling lane with controlled precision, and he moved to catch the mother before she met the marble. His left arm entered Elena Ward's fall line in a clean arc, white glove opening under her shoulder blades with the precision of a practiced drill and the urgency of a battlefield save. And even in that compressed instant, Derek Sloan kept talking into his earpiece as though volume could overrule gravity, protocol, and loss. The cable at his feet stayed stretched across the medic lane, black against pale stone like a drawn boundary between two value systems, one built on ratings windows and one built on vows. Keith's right boot landed exactly on count. His torso stayed upright. His chin stayed level. He caught Elena's descending weight high and controlled, absorbing her momentum through his hips without collapsing posture, while her son's reaching arm found Keith's forearm and steadied there for half a breath. What unfolded in that narrow aisle had begun long before that morning, and long before Sloan ever stepped onto Arlington's marble. His reputation had been assembled in green rooms, boardrooms, and emergency press corridors where the currency was access, not reverence. He had made his name as a crisis public relations enforcer for executives who wanted bad headlines buried before the closing bell, then shifted into private security contracting when networks realized that controlling a perimeter with legal language and intimidation could protect a broadcast timetable better than any producer's plea. He wore tailored charcoal, narrow tie knots, polished shoes, and gold cufflinks engraved with his initials, each detail announcing the same doctrine. He expected passage. On ordinary assignments, that doctrine worked. Assistants moved. Venue staff yielded. City barricades flexed when he produced the right badge clip, spoke in clipped legal phrases and implied consequences. At Arlington, he arrived with that same machinery already running. Credentials around his neck, 2 comms channels live, a media packet signed and stamped with perimeter boundaries highlighted in yellow. He had nodded through the briefing with visible impatience, then redirected his crew the moment his preferred camera angle conflicted with Gold Star seating rules. He ordered a cable run through the family lane because it shaved seconds off signal routing. He positioned a rolling battery pack beside the volunteer medic aisle, because it kept his operators close to center frame. When a ceremony NCO corrected him, he flashed his contract and said, "We're on deadline." When an usher asked him to respect the marked line, he brushed past with a hand gesture used for hotel staff and interns. Nothing in his demeanor changed as mourners passed within arm's reach, carrying private devastation in public silence. By 10:17 that morning, the cold had sharpened enough that every command over an earpiece came out as white breath. Sloane's came out fast and hard. "Hold center. Push in on the family." "No, tighter." "Keep that uniform in the foreground." The uniform he meant was Keith Reyes, reduced in Sloane's language to visual texture, a ceremonial silhouette to improve the shot. That was his fatal error made visible. He categorized the sentinel as static, set dressing, not active protector. He read discipline as passivity. He read silence as compliance. He read sacred protocol as negotiable inconvenience. Even now, with Elena's weight settling into Keith's support arm, Sloane stayed planted in the lane and raised a palm toward the medic as if directing traffic at a loading dock. "Do not break frame," he snapped to his nearest operator. "We're live in 8. The operator's hands hesitated on the camera rig. A second crew member looked down at the taut cable, then up at Elena's ashen face, then back toward Sloane for instruction. Caught between employment and conscience. Sloane answered with a hard chin lift toward the lens, not the family. Keith did not look at the lens. He looked at Elena's airway, her eye focus, and the angle of her neck. His grip adjusted by centimeters, right forearm bracing her upper back, while his left hand shifted beneath her shoulder to keep her from turning into the cable line. His voice, when it came, was low and level, formal enough to carry command without spectacle. "This lane is for the fallen and their families. Stand down." The sentence crossed stone like a blade drawn once and sheathed. Conversations died mid-word. A child in the east section stopped crying and stared. The teenage boy behind the Marine lowered his head for one instant, then looked up with the stunned expression of someone seeing a ceremony become protection in real time. The retired Army nurse at the second column gave one short nod, then moved exactly when the lane opened, no sooner, no later. Sloane took a half-step forward anyway, phone in one hand, earpiece wire taut against his collar. "You don't give me orders, parade boy." He said it louder than necessary, as if speaking to the crowd rather than the man supporting a Gold Star mother. The words landed, then turned against him immediately. Gasps spread through the seats in an uneven wave. An older veteran muttered, "Not here." A woman in black near the aisle whispered, "Have some decency." A schoolteacher pulled her students a fraction closer to the row rail and kept their eyes forward, unwilling to let them miss what standards looked like under pressure. Keith's face did not change. The mask of discipline held. Inside, his body was in full combat accounting mode. Elena's pulse flutter against his glove, son's footing unstable at the cable edge, medic 2 steps out. MP detail descending left flank. Colonel Whitaker closing from the command corridor with direct line of sight. He felt the old scar under his jaw tighten, with cold and adrenaline. He did not accelerate. He regulated. He gave Elena a stable platform, shifted his stance to clear her knees from the battery pack wheel, and angled her toward the medic's open path as soon as Sloane's crewman, finally shaken, yanked the cable slack. That crewman's movement became its own indictment. He looked at Elena, then at Keith, then ripped the line back with both hands, so fast the connector head slapped stone. He did not wait for Sloane's permission. The medic surged through the gap, trauma bag bumping her hip, and dropped to Elena's left side. "Ma'am, stay with me. Can you hear me?" Elena's eyelids fluttered. Her son answered for her, voice breaking. She hasn't eaten. She hasn't slept. The medic nodded once, clinically calm, fingers at Elena's wrist, then at her jawline. We've got her. Sloan pivoted toward the camera again, trying to recover control by force of routine. Stay on me, he hissed. But no one followed that command cleanly. One operator lowered his rig. Another stepped backward out of the lane entirely. The visual hierarchy had changed. The room no longer recognized Sloan as authority. At the base of the west steps, Colonel Ava Whitaker arrived with military police in disciplined spacing behind her. Her service coat was buttoned to the throat, insignia bright, expression carved in the same hard material as the amphitheater itself. She took in the entire tableau in one sweep. Elena, supported by Keith and medic, cable across restricted lane, media equipment beyond boundary tape, Sloan still posturing in front of mourners. Her voice cut through the cold with command-grade clarity. Mr. Sloan, remove your credential. Now. He turned, opened his mouth to object, and she gave him nothing to work with. You interfered with a military funeral and obstructed medical access in a restricted family lane. Military police escort him from federal grounds and initiate citation processing. 2 MPs stepped in, professional and unhurried, one to either side. Sloan held his badge clip up like a legal shield. It had no effect. The senior MP took it from his hand, passed it to Whitaker, and guided Sloan toward the outer rail while the second MP directed the remaining crew to break down and move to the designated perimeter under supervision. Across the amphitheater, people registered that removal as quiet rather than dramatic, which made it heavier. No tackle, no shouting match, just consequence, applied in full view of veterans, children, and grieving kin. Sloan tried once more over his shoulder. You're making a mistake. Whitaker answered without raising her voice. The mistake was yours. He said nothing after that. He was led down the side steps and out through the service gate, cufflinks flashing once in the winter light before disappearing behind stone. Back in the lane, the confrontation did not end. It narrowed into care. Keith lowered with Elena in controlled stages, one knee bending only when the medic signaled ready, keeping her spine aligned and her head supported until the nurse and medic transferred full contact. Her son knelt beside her, one hand on her gloved wrist, lips moving in a steady stream of reassurance that sounded like prayer. The granddaughter remained in place near the row end, folded flag held tight, eyes wet but steady. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair lifted 2 fingers to his brow in a small, private salute toward Keith, then toward Elena, honoring both endurance and burden. Keith rose on count, reestablished ceremonial posture, and stepped back exactly enough to clear the medic team while preserving lane integrity. To civilians, the transition looked near superhuman, from active rescue to formal stillness in a breath. To Keith, it was training carrying grief where emotion alone would stumble. Every tendon in his shoulders burned from controlled load transfer. His pulse ran hard at the base of his throat. His breathing stayed even. 4 count in, 4 count out. The same regulation that had steadied him under rotor wash and tracer fire. He checked Elena once with a brief downward glance for color return and chest rise, then returned his eyes to the fixed forward point protocol required. Around him, the amphitheater slowly exhaled. Whispered fragments passed row to row, not gossip, witness. He never broke stride. He caught her like he knew. That's what they're trained for. A father in a dark overcoat crouched to his son's height and said quietly, "Remember this part." The son nodded, eyes still on Keith's boots. The little girl with the folded flag took one careful step toward her uncle, then stopped when an usher offered a gentle hand and guided her to clear space for medics. She did not loosen her grip on the cloth. by the time the chaplain resumed position at the lectern. 10 minutes had passed that felt both suspended and exact. The wind had shifted slightly east, carrying the faint scent of evergreen from lower grounds. MPS completed perimeter reset. The cable was gone. The battery pack was removed. A ceremony NCO confirmed lane clearance with 2 discrete hand signals that traveled along the detail like current through wire. Whitaker remained at the rail for 1 additional minute, watching Elena stabilized onto a transport chair and move toward the medical room with her son and granddaughter beside her. Only when she saw that family in safe motion did she turn back to the ceremony commander and nod once. Keith resumed cadence. Boots clicked in perfect rhythm. Shoulders squared. Face unreadable. 21 steps measured across stone where chaos had tried and failed to enter. He paused, turned, and repeated, not as performance, but as a vow kept under test. Every muscle in him stayed coiled for another emergency, if one came. Every instinct remained lit. Yet from the seats he appeared as he had appeared at first light. Unflinching sentinel. White gloves steady, brass catching cold sun. Guardian of a place where history was not recited but carried. The crowd watched differently now, not with tourist curiosity, with comprehension. They had seen the hidden depth beneath the immaculate exterior and understood that the same discipline that honored the unknown dead also shielded the living who came to mourn them. In that understanding, outrage settled into respect, and respect into something quieter and stronger. The amphitheater returned to order. The ceremony moved forward. The sacred held. The order held for less than a minute before Derek Sloan tried to wrench it back. The initial removal had already been ordered and was in motion, but the escort had not yet cleared federal grounds or completed citation processing when he made his move. He had been halfway down the side steps under MP control when he twisted at the waist, dug his heels into the marble, and threw his voice over his shoulder toward the nearest camera still pointed his way. He put hands on a civilian. You all got that, right? The words cracked across the amphitheater's lower rail, brittle with panic disguised as outrage. One operator flinched and lowered his lens. Another kept filming. Not for Sloan now, but for the record. Keith Reyes was 3 paces into the next cycle. Boots striking clean, chin level, shoulders square. He did not turn his head. He did not feed the noise, yet his peripheral read tracked every variable as precisely as before. Sloan's centerline, pulling against the MP grip, the crowd's attention drifting toward the disruption, the medic team guiding Elena Ward along the inside route toward the medical room, and the narrow point where those paths would cross if Sloan got one more step. 90 seconds after the first removal order, consequence had not fully landed. It had only arrived. Sloan tore one arm free from his coat hem, pointed back toward Keith, and tried to step uphill against the escort. You can't touch me for this. I'm credentialed. The senior MP shifted his stance and blocked him at the hip with controlled force, professional and spare. You were credentialed, he answered. Keep moving. Sloan jerked again, shoulders snapping forward, then spotted Elena being transported in a chair, with her son at the handles and the volunteer medic at her left knee. His expression changed from anger to calculation in a single instant. He cut toward them. It was one movement, sharp and predatory. Not a strike, not a shove, but a lane intrusion by a man still convinced access belonged to whoever demanded it loudest. Elena's granddaughter, still carrying the folded flag against her chest, walked close beside the chair and looked up in confusion as Sloan angled in and lifted his phone. Mrs. Ward, one statement, he called, voice suddenly smooth, newsroom polished. Just 10 seconds for... Keith broke protocol. The gasp that rippled through the crowd sounded like fabric tearing. On the 12th count of his lane, he pivoted off cadence and stepped diagonally into the intercept corridor with astonishing economy. No wasted motion, no dramatic flourish, just pure train geometry. White glove rows, body aligned. He set himself between Sloane and the family chair before Sloane reached arm's length, boots planted on marble as if driven there by iron stakes. His face remained unreadable, but his presence filled the lane like a locked gate. Clear this, family. Now. The line was low, formal, and absolute. It did not sound loud. It sounded final. Sloane froze mid-step, phone still up, mouth parted around a protest that never formed. For one suspended beat, he looked smaller, a man in expensive wool standing inches from a standard he could neither purchase nor intimidate. Behind Keith, Elena's son tightened both hands on the chair grips and steered his mother through the opening Keith had just carved. The medic moved with him, one hand steady at Elena's shoulder. The granddaughter passed close, eyes wide, flag clutched to her coat, and Keith shifted half an inch to widen her path, without dropping his stare from Sloane. The amphitheater watched in complete silence. The elderly Marine in the wheelchair lifted his chin and held it there, a weathered witness measuring one generation against another. The retired Army nurse near the second column exhaled through her nose and gave one sharp nod, the kind a professional gives when a textbook intervention appears under impossible pressure. School children leaned forward. No whispers now, just stillness and attention. Even the clergy detail at the lectern paused, hands folded, as if the ceremony itself had made room for that command. Sloane found his voice and tried contempt again because it was the only weapon he knew. "You're a prop in a costume. Move." He said it softer this time, almost to himself, as if testing whether the old script still worked. It did not. Keith did not blink. "You obstructed medical access at a military funeral," he said. "You are done here." Two MPs closed the distance from Sloane's blind side and locked his arms with practiced control. There was no slam, no spectacle, just secure contact and forward movement. Sloane's phone slipped from his hand, bounced once on stone, and skidded to the base of a rail post. An MP kicked it clear of foot traffic and marked the location with his boot toe for evidence collection. The crowd released a second wave of breath, heavier than the first, and at the lower steps, Colonel Ava Whitaker arrived inside that silence, like a verdict already signed. Her gaze moved from Keith to Elena's departing chair, then to Sloane in MP hold, then down to the dropped phone and the cable marks still faintly visible across marble. She did not raise her voice. Authority made volume unnecessary. Sergeant Reyes returned to ceremonial lane. Keith snapped a single nod, stepped back into line, and re-entered cadence on count, as if the interruption had never fractured rhythm. Boots struck stone, shoulders squared. 21 resumed. Then Whitaker faced Sloane. For the witnesses and the incident record, she restated the order already in execution. "For the record and in view of all present," she said, "your media credential is revoked under ceremony security authority. You are being removed from Arlington National Cemetery for interference with funeral operations and obstruction of emergency care." Sloane strained against the hold enough to wrinkle his suit shoulders. "This is retaliation. He assaulted me on camera." Whitaker turned 1 degree to the camera cluster and answered him where every witness could hear. "What these cameras recorded was a United States Army sentinel protecting a Gold Star family and preserving a medical lane you unlawfully blocked." Her eyes came back to Sloane. "You will address me as Colonel, and you will remain silent unless questioned." The words hit harder than shouting would have. Sloan stopped talking. Minutes later, pale sunlight edged farther across the west colonnade and laid thin bars of brightness over the steps where MPs completed the immediate documentation tied to the in-progress removal and citation action. The dropped phone was bagged in clear plastic and tagged with time, location, and chain of custody initials. Sloan's revoked badge clip went into a second bag beside it. A third MP photographed the cable scuff line and battery pack wheel marks where the medic lane had been obstructed. Nothing was left to argument. Stone remembered, and so did procedure. Whitaker signaled to Captain Leland Price from the legal detail, a compact judge advocate with service ribbons tight over his chest pocket and a notebook already open. He stepped forward, confirmed identity, and read Sloan the federal citation language in clipped, exact terms while an MP body cam captured every word. Sloan tried once to interrupt. Price held up 2 fingers without looking up. You will have an opportunity to respond in writing. The interruption died there. In the second row, the veteran nurse who had tracked Keith from the start was asked for a witness statement. She gave it in calm, unembellished sentences. Lane blocked, mother collapsing, medic delayed, sentinel intervention timely and proportionate. The elderly Marine gave his statement next, voice thin but steady, ending with, "That sergeant did his duty," and more. A schoolteacher provided confirmation from the youth section. The teenage boy, hands shaking slightly, offered that he had stopped filming before the collapse and then resumed only when Sloan rushed the family. Each account aligned. Each tightened the frame around what had happened. External coordination landed 3 minutes later. An MP at Whitaker's shoulder received confirmation over encrypted radio from Federal Protective Service dispatch. Removal logged, citation accepted, and administrative ban pending review based on interference at a military funeral. Whitaker acknowledged with a single copy, then had the message repeated into the incident recorder, so no part of the chain remained informal. Sloan heard every word. The color left his face, not dramatic, just enough to show the first real comprehension that consequence had moved beyond this plaza and into systems he could not charm. He looked once toward his crew. No one met his eyes. "Escort him," Whitaker said. The MPs turned him down the service corridor at a measured pace, hands controlled at the triceps. No roughness, no delay, carrying the already issued removal through to final gate exit. He tried one final line over his shoulder, stripped now of swagger. "You're ruining my contract." Whitaker answered without changing expression. "You ruined it when you treated a military funeral like a set." He did not speak again. The service gate closed behind him with a muted metal thud that seemed, in that moment, to restore pressure to the room. Whitaker remained at the rail only long enough to watch Elena's chair reach the medical doorway safely with family alongside, then stepped to the edge of Keith's lane as he passed on count. She did not force him to halt. She timed her words to his turn, respecting both protocol and the man inside it. "Sergeant Reyes," she said, voice low enough for command, loud enough for nearby witnesses. "Your intervention was lawful, disciplined, and in keeping with the highest standards of the old guard." Keith's eyes stayed forward. "Yes, ma'am. That family will remember today for the right reason, because you were exactly where duty required." He gave one crisp nod at the pause, then turned and resumed the next count. Rifle steady, white gloves still, boots ringing across marble with renewed clarity. Around him, the crowd straightened almost in unison, not instructed, simply compelled. Veterans settled into formal posture. Parents drew children close. Programs were lifted again. Heads bowed as the chaplain returned to the lectern, and the service continued under restored order. Near the medical corridor threshold, Elena's granddaughter looked back once over her shoulder, folded flag held tight to her chest, and found Keith in motion where he belonged, a sentinel in full cadence, guarding both memory and the living who carried it. He passed the center mark of the lane and turned on count, the movement so exact it seemed carved into the marble itself. Boots struck stone in a steady report that gathered scattered nerves and pulled them back into order. The chaplain resumed at the lectern, voice low and deliberate, and the words of committal moved through the amphitheater like a measured tide. No one in the first rows looked toward the service gate anymore. They looked toward the casket lane, toward the flag, toward the men whose discipline had refused to bend when grief buckled. The old Marine in the wheelchair kept his fingertips at his brow for one breath longer, then lowered his hand to his lap and sat straighter than his years should have allowed. The retired Army nurse returned to her place by the second column, chin set, eyes on Elena's departing chair until the doorway swallowed it. The teenage boy, who had lowered his phone earlier, stood with both hands empty now, as if he understood that witnessing came before recording. The dropped program that had slapped Stone during the collapse was quietly retrieved by the school teacher, smoothed once along a trembling edge, and handed back to the student who had lost it. The child took it with both hands and held it flat against her coat like a fragile document. Keith completed another cycle. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Inside the medical room, fluorescent light replaced winter marble, and the air held the sterile scent of antiseptic wipes and warmed blankets. Elena Ward sat reclined in a transport chair, with a blood pressure cuff still around her arm, color returning slowly to her face. Her son knelt beside her, elbows on his knees, eyes red but steady. The volunteer medic checked Elena's pulse once more, then looked to the veteran nurse who had come in to assist, and gave a small professional nod. She fainted from stress and exhaustion. Vitals are stabilizing. No head strike, no secondary trauma. Elena swallowed, voice thin. Did we stop the service? Her son shook his head immediately. No, Mom. They kept it dignified. They kept it right. The granddaughter edged closer, flag still against her chest. Grandma, the soldier caught you. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at the child with a painful, grateful softness. Then we owe him thanks. In the corridor outside, Captain Leland Price stood at a folding command table, reviewing the evidence chain under a portable task light. The dropped phone sat in a sealed clear bag with the timestamp visible. Beside it, Sloane's revoked credential rested in a second bag marked with the Whitaker's initials and MP witness signatures. A third evidence envelope held printed stills of the cable intrusion and wheel marks that had crossed the medic lane. Price checked each tag against the incident log, then passed the packets one by one to the senior MP for lock transfer. Phone, credential, and scene images received at 10:43. Continuous custody maintained, he read aloud for the recorder. Forwarding to Federal Citation File and Cemetery Command Archive. The MP repeated each line into body cam audio and signed. At the outer rail, one of Sloane's camera operators approached under escort, shoulders tense, media badge flipped backward in his hand. He held out a memory card between two fingers. I have full footage from my angle, he said, voice tight with controlled shame. Includes his lane order and the obstruction. I'm submitting it voluntarily. Price accepted it without commentary, logged serial number, and sealed it as supplemental evidence. The operator glanced once toward the amphitheater floor where Keith's cadence continued, then lowered his gaze. For what it's worth, Sergeant Reyes was the only one acting like this was sacred. He stopped there. He had more to say, but it never came, and no one asked him to force it. By the time the honor detail moved into final flagfold sequence, sunlight had shifted west and turned the colonnade shadows long and blue across the steps. Wind carried a faint, evergreen note from Lower Arlington and the metallic ghost of the earlier bugle call. Keith remained in his lane through every command phase, posture unbroken, breath measured, instinct still live. At one turn, he passed Colonel Whitaker at the rail. She gave no further public remark, only the briefest nod between professionals who understood that some validations were strongest when not performed for applause. When the folded family flag was presented to the Ward family in the medical receiving alcove rather than the front row, it was done with full ceremony, no corners cut. Elena had insisted on standing. 2 attendants helped her rise, and she held through the presentation, unshaking legs. Back straight, chin lifted. Her son supported her elbow without speaking. Her granddaughter watched from one step away, then helped receive that same folded flag into her family's hands, eyes wide with the weight of heritage passing through cloth. The old Marine was wheeled to the corridor after dismissal and asked quietly if he might greet Elena for a moment. She nodded. He removed his cap before speaking. "Ma'am," he said, voice scraped by age and memory, "your son was honored today the way a warrior should be honored." Elena reached out with her gloved hand and gripped his fingers. Neither tried to add more. 3 minutes later, a junior MP brought Colonel Whitaker the final dispatch callback printout from Federal Protective Service. She read it once under the corridor light. Removal executed, citation accepted, temporary access ban active, pending formal review. She signed receipt and handed the sheet to Captain Price for inclusion in the case jacket. External contact closed. Administrative outcome recorded. On the amphitheater floor, the service concluded. Guests began to file in quiet rows, shoes whispering over stone, voices reduced to fragments that sounded more like prayer than conversation. The maintenance cart bell that had chimed once during the crisis passed again on the far service road, this time muted by distance. It had meant nothing then and nothing now, only ordinary work continuing at the edge of sacred duty. The black cable scuff across the lane was scrubbed by cemetery staff until marble returned to clean pale grain. The battery pack wheel marks disappeared with it. No trace of intrusion remained where the family had walked. Keith was relieved from ceremony detail at the designated handoff point, then reassigned to evening watch rotation near the tomb. He moved there without fanfare, crossing the familiar ground between amphitheater and the white sweep of headstones under a sky fading from hard winter silver toward dusk. A detail sergeant met him at the post check, confirmed times, and said only, "Lane report was solid." Keith answered, "Yes, Sergeant," and took his place. Before the next watch cycle began, Elena's family was escorted along the upper rail for departure. She walked slowly, but under her own strength, one hand on her son's arm, the other resting atop the folded flag. The granddaughter stepped out of line for a heartbeat, stopping at a respectful distance from Keith's path as he reached his pause. Her voice was small but clear in the cold air. "Thank you for not letting her fall." Keith did not break bearing. He gave one precise nod. The child nodded back as if she had been entrusted with something formal, then returned to her family. The old Marine, waiting near the rail, watched that exchange and pressed his lips together against rising emotion. The retired Army nurse caught his eye and said quietly, "He was scanning the whole front row from the start." The Marine answered, "That's what Guardians do." The loaded recognition passed between them and settled into shared certainty. Dusk gathered across Arlington in disciplined gradients. Flags stirred on distant poles. Headstones stood row on row like ranks holding formation beyond sight. At the tomb, marble carried the last light in a pale, unwavering sheen. Keith stepped into cadence. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. White gloves pristine. Uniform immaculate. Face carved from stone. Eyes locked forward. Every instinct awake beneath stillness. The day's noise had been processed by command, logged by law, witnessed by citizens, and answered by duty. A man who mistook access for authority had been removed. A family had been protected. A ceremony had finished with honor intact. Across the plaza, visitors slowed without being told. Some removed hats, some simply stood and listened to the cadence ring against marble and fade into the evening air. The moral truth settled there without speech or spectacle. Real honor was not loud, not purchased, not improvised for cameras. It was earned in sacrifice, held in discipline, and proven in the instant when someone vulnerable needed a guardian. Keith reached the end of the lane and turned again, the tomb at his shoulder, the flag above, the white headstones descending behind him into gathering night, and the sacred order of remembrance restored step by measured step.